Let's talk about climate change hypocrites. And in particular, let's talk about Mike Cannon-Brookes of Atlassian. Because news recently came about that he'd gone out and acquired a private jet, in addition to sponsoring an F1 racing team, all while lecturing us about climate change and sustainability. There's possibly a reason he's much derided in the Australian Financial Review, amongst other publications. Now, the situation here is Mike Cannon-Brookes had been particularly focused on climate change and sustainability. Some of you might remember the shenanigans involving AGL and its demerger plans, which were ultimately shelved, in large part because Mike Cannon-Brookes' venture got a large stake in AGL and then resisted the plans for that demerger, at least in part because he wasn't satisfied with the climate change and sustainability plans. It didn't appear, to my mind anyway, to be a financial resistance so much as a decision to oppose it for ideological grounds. Henceforth, the demerger did not go ahead. Fast forward a little bit, and Atlassian and Mike Cannon-Brookes appear to have acquired a private jet. So they're lecturing us on the one hand about perhaps sustainability, improving climate change and the like, while on the other hand acquiring a private jet. Similarly, Mike Cannon-Brookes has sponsored an F1 racing team. So let's dig a little bit into this, and if you've got any thoughts about it, well, let me know that in the comments below. Now let's focus on that private jet, for example. Mike Cannon-Brookes has said he had internal conflict over acquiring the private jet. Internal conflict, it appears, about how much emissions it was going to create relative to his publicly stated views on climate change. Internal conflict about whether or not those could be reconciled, and perhaps internal conflict about what the optics would look like. After all, the optics haven't been particularly good, and it has been front page news on places like Australian Financial Review and The Australian. Now, these private jets, they aren't exactly the most sustainable aircraft. There's arguments that in the best case scenario, they could in fact be okay for climate change. By which I mean that if, for example, Mike Cannon-Brookes were to fill up his private jet with a lot of other people that happen to be going in that one location, for example, renting out seats or whatever the case might be, and he were to use it in the most efficient manner possible, then potentially it might be a little bit better, in fact, for the environment than first class under that best case scenario. And that in part is because private jets can be relatively fuel efficient relative to a big commercial jet. And then you add on to this that in first class in a big commercial jet, it's often relatively non-dense. There aren't that many people in first class. Now, to be clear, that's the best case scenario. It assumes that he isn't just flying over there with himself or a couple of other people, but rather the private jet is full up. It also assumes that he doesn't have to comply with the various other regulations that require a detour for refueling and the like, which adds on kilometers and adds on fuel consumption. Because often there are aviation regulations that require you to stop partway along a trip so that you have at least a minimum amount of fuel. More fuel than you really need, but a minimum amount in case you need to do circling or turn back or whatever the case might be. And that can add to your fuel consumption. So assuming the best case scenario, maybe the private jet isn't too bad. But often, we don't live in that fantasy world where it's flying in that best case scenario. So the private jet is not exactly fuel efficient. Then we add on to this the F1 team. Now, Mike Cannon-Brookes has been at pains to emphasize the sustainability efforts of F1, the efforts to try to improve how environmentally friendly Formula One is. After all, F1 has, 20 cars racing around a grid. It consumes fuel, sure, and it also consumes rubber with the tires. However, in the grand scheme of things, compared to all of the other cars we've got around, well, it doesn't necessarily consume that much carbon relative to things we do in day-to-day life. And it appears that another CEO happens to agree with me, and that is Tim Fung, who happens to run Airtasker. He's quoted in The Australian as saying, "First of all, it's 20 cars buzzing around. That's not going to be creating an actual emissions problem. We've got millions of cars on the road in Australia. That's not going to be a drag on F1, said Mr. Fung, who has also sponsored a team to facilitate his US expansion plans. He is, quote, less political about sustainability goals. And then The Australian quotes him as saying, "We generally stay out of politics. We stand for helping create jobs for people." That's probably what people want from their CEOs. People want companies to generally stay out of politics unless it is core to what that company is actually doing. After all, if a political issue does affect the company's core operations, then of course they should get involved in it. But if that issue is tangential to what that company is doing, then people would generally prefer the CEO or the company to stay out of things. Now that might mean the CEO has to be relatively more quiet than they would like, but that's part of what comes with being a CEO. And this also affects people like Elon Musk. Now I happen to empathize a lot with what Elon Musk is doing. However, it has affected the operations of Tesla. It appears that some people don't particularly like his ideology, and they've stopped buying Tesla cars. That of course is their prerogative. No one is forcing anyone to buy a particular vehicle. And of course, when they're stopping to buy Tesla, you have to ask, well, what are your alternatives? You've got some of the Chinese manufacturers, so BYD for example. Now some of those manufacturers have come under concerns for whether or not there's surveillance technology in those vehicles. That's certainly a warning that's been issued by some governments, and that does give one pause about buying those vehicles. And of course, you've got the various other manufacturers that are priced much higher than Tesla. So people can boycott a company if they don't like its politics, but sometimes they're going to ultimately end up hurting themselves. Now, circling back around to Mike Cannon-Brookes, I have no particular issue with him at a personal level. I've heard that he is a very nice person. I've heard that he's a good boss. I've heard only good things about him at a personal level. However, it does not sit well with me when someone is lecturing us about climate change, but then also doing things like getting a private jet. It's almost like it's one rule for him and another rule for everyone else. Or he's tied himself in knots to try to justify why it is that he needs a private jet and the rest of us need to cut back on gas, for example, in our homes, or do various other things that we find particularly undesirable, or perhaps go out and acquire EVs, which are sometimes more expensive and run into issues with battery degradation and run into issues with fires. And on the topic of EVs, it's often claimed that EV fires are relatively rare compared to internal combustion engines. But that's not really the point. The point is that when you've got an EV fire, it's significantly more damaging and significantly more costly. So you need to consider what is the probability of the fire and the cost of that fire. And with EVs, that cost is exponentially higher than with internal combustion engines. But regardless, Mike Cannon-Brookes is lecturing us or doing the opposite. It appears to be symptomatic of a number of CEOs, and indeed symptomatic to my mind of a number of the teal representatives, who go around lecturing people what to do, while also not doing it themselves. The people who go around lecturing people about having wind farms or solar panels or solar fields, while being nowhere near them themselves. Or the people who will go around lecturing us about lockdowns and the like, while also not really being very much affected by them. Either because their job is entirely work from home anyway, so they could just transition and it doesn't really cost them anything, or because they perhaps are in a larger property so it doesn't really cost them anything. Now personally I hope that Mike Cannon-Brookes perhaps realizes this issue and tones down some of his rhetoric and moves a little bit away from some of the more strident positions he's taken. And it appears he is making some of that. For example, on the emissions from Atlassian, he says, "We run a lot of servers at Atlassian. We have to deliver products to our customers. Turning off those servers isn't going to help those customers. However, we need a plan to be able to run those servers in an effective way, improving each year. That's what our sustainability plan is all about." Atlassian has always been set up as a long-term company. We talk about sustainability. We want to be here in 10 to 20 years. That means we need to have our staff here. We need human rights are important. And if you look at our sustainability report, it means the communities we exist in, the cities, the areas that support us as a business, and it means the planet. So what Mike Cannon-Brookes is saying here is that if we just turn off coal-fired power plants and gas immediately, then we run into a problem. We need to actually have a proper long-term think about this. And the implication of this, of course, is that maybe we should actually be maintaining coal-fired power plants unless and until there's an effective and cost-effective alternative. Because if we don't maintain them, then we get an unreliable power sector, and if we get an unreliable power sector, then we get energy prices going up, which is now happening. But let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below.